So now I'm going to introduce to you two concepts: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are cases and legislation. Start using that word now, Yeah, I've read ledge. Now that's the first vernacular you learn. I'm a lawyer. I know what legislation.
I am. You're too cool for me. Like, I don't think I've ever called it ledge in my life. I'm
ledge.
On the ledge, thinking I should throw myself over, trying to find it and read it.
No, it's the ledge. Hashtag. Secondary sources are the journals and scholarly articles, right? So these two, you have to remember: primary, secondary, primary.
So the way I think about that is think about, particularly those of you who come from any kind of science background or anything like that, think of primary sources are always the data. So the actual data that you're using. And so if we have case law or if we have legislation, whether it's historical or current, that's data that you're using. You're looking straight at the data. Secondary is people writing about the data, which again has hierarchies in it. So we have peer-reviewed scholarly journals, but actually, frankly, in law, a judge writing or speaking about a case probably ranks higher than a researcher if it's a judge in the right jurisdiction. So again, it's not quite as straightforward as it otherwise would be, but I know Justice Kirby, for example, writes a lot or has spoken a lot before he retired, actually, and since, about legal writing and how to write well as a lawyer. And I would give precedence, to use that term, to anything he writes over what scholars write about legal writing for what I think are relatively obvious reasons. But then you'll also find actually another source, particularly in really modern areas, will be law firms. Law firms will write about particular areas or particular cases. And again, particularly from a currency point of view, they're weighted differently, but they're important as well compared to scholarly writers. Scholarly writers will take a whole lot of data and write about it and synthesize it together in a way that the law firms probably can't. But if you're actually reading something that's written by a firm that was instructing in a particular case, that is gold. That is actually weighted relatively high. And if a barrister has written a case note, particularly about a case that they were involved in, or that they actually sat in and saw the argument, then again, that might have a higher weighting. So there's lots of stuff that's going on in that space. So making a decision about the weighting you want to give a secondary material, you need to, primary, secondary, but you need to weight each. So more current in primary materials usually has more weight than something historical. Not always, it will depend on your question, but mostly that would be true. And in relation to secondary materials, think about who the author is and what their interest is in order to think about the weight that you give it.
Now, we won't be going through the platforms today. We're just showing you.
Yeah, what's available, absolutely.
Now, following on from what Kath is saying about who writes these materials and why you should weight it. So I've put in Adani judgment in Allen. So Adani is that big coal mine up in Queensland. It's very contentious because the tailings will be going into the Great Barrier Reef. There are multiple orders stopping the...
so many issues in that particular one too, because Adani itself is an Indian company, so it's a foreign investment company. It was looking for financing. There's a whole range of significant issues in that particular
One
matter.
of the cases I remember about Adani, there are numerous Adani cases, right? So environmental groups were taking it to court, unions were taking it to court, just multiple actions. But one of the case was that in 2016, they had to stop all their construction because there was a skink, a lizard, which was in one of the swamp areas, which was going to have a rail and a jetty built directing to Great Barrier Reef. And because of this lizard, the construction was stopped. So now how do I know this? Because I'm a nerd, don't worry about that. You can look what I'm doing there in Google. I put in Adani Judgment Allens. I knew Allens wrote about this. Allens is one of the top firms in Australia. And going back to what Kath is saying about how law firms write about matters that they have carriage on. So I can look at that and you can click on that and they go, there you go. And they talk about the climate change because they were involved in that matter.
Yeah.
So you can look at that and go, oh, interesting. Again, talking about sides, right? Law, as black and white as it is, it's always about sides. The evidence coming from this side and evidence coming from the other side. And it goes back to when I spoke about how I show my homework to a still going to judge and two different answers come through. Like, oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah, I'm interested you say black and white. I think ultimately it's a spectrum of grey.